It's my pleasure to announce Dr. Stephen Shepard. He teaches sustainable landscape planning, climate change, communications and visualization at the University of British Columbia. Stephen directs the Collaborative for Advanced Landscape Planning, a research group using future scenarios and 3D visualization tools to support community engagement and planning on climate change. He has over 30 years' experience as a consultant in environmental assessment, energy planning, and public participation. He was a reviewer of the IPCC fourth assessment and heads the social mobilization research theme for the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. His recent research projects focus on new visioning methods for communicating local climate change futures and informing public perceptions of clean energy. And we are looking forward to his latest book, which is supposed to be published later this year on visualization climate change. Stephen, would you please? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Better make sure I know how to do this way, right? Okay. So, as was just introduced, I'm a landscape architect and a planner, so I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here, but I have found lots and lots of points of connection, which is really helpful. So perhaps there'll be some things here that resonate, and I particularly want to go a little bit further than perhaps Gary and Conrad have done, pick up some of their points and put it into the context of sort of community planning, because that's really the area that we work in. Can everybody hear me okay? Is that the volume all right? So we're going to talk about some of these new tools and processes that we've been experimenting with at UBC, at Cal. This is just one example. Jennifer, I don't know if it's the same example you're going to use, is it?
No.
Oh, good. Okay, different one. All right. Then. So this is what we consider a high-carbon landscape. This is an environment. We have aging communities as well as aging people in those communities. This is in part of Burnaby, could be almost anywhere in North America. And we explore what the futures could be like using very simple tools like Photoshop and more complex analytical tools as well to give people a better idea of what these futures could look like. And there are multiple messages there about climate change, adaptation, mitigation, but also walkability and health and many other issues. So I'm sure Larry's going to speak a lot more about some of those in a minute too. So I just wanted to touch on a few points that occurred to me of sort of resonance with the issue of the elderly, and these sort of include some ways that we can begin to make some of the connections that people have talked about, some of the gaps in people's perceptions that relate to the elderly and others, and think a little bit about the special role that the elderly play. Again, we've heard some of these ideas of champions, etc., and see if we can explore some ways to improve our sort of communication, yes, but also our planning and our decision-making about communities with aging in place particularly in mind, and finish up with how older folks like myself and others can engage with some of the newer media that might seem a bit foreign. So we've heard a lot about the impacts on the aged of health and vulnerability. I'm certainly not an expert in that area. I accept that, but I think we do need to make that connection to the causes. And as baby boomers, we are, to a large extent, the cause of much of climate change, if you believe in anthropogenic climate change. Most of it's come in our generation. And to take the point that I think came up just a minute ago, we need to find ways to link adaptation and mitigation, because there are co-benefits and we risk shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't deal with both of them. We owe it to ourselves to adapt for our protection, and we owe it to the rest of the world and to future generations to mitigate. So my one quick nod on health is just to, if you haven't seen this already, there's some recent research out on carbon itself having an impact, never mind climate change. Carbon dioxide apparently can cause carbon dioxide domes over certain cities that can be associated with increased mortality just based on the carbon dioxide. So you may want to look at Jacobson's work if you're interested in that. But I wanted to just play with a little bit. This is a bit like Gary's drawing of the triangle, but we're going to use a circle instead. And a lot of the discussion about climate change has to do with the impacts of climate change. That's what we've been talking about, the impacts on the ages, the impacts on our locality, the impacts of Katrina, this kind of thing. But it's only half the story. It comes from somewhere. It doesn't come from the sky. It comes from the earth. And the greatest agent of change on the earth is mankind. So common sense would suggest we're causing this, as well as the science supports that in general. There may be natural causes as well. But essentially, it's a loop. What goes around comes around. Grandmothers taught us this. You push here, something will push back somewhere else. So logic would suggest these things are connected, and the scientific models, I think, bear that out. So we've been experimenting with ways to make these connections a little bit more clear. We are a research group, so we're experimenting and testing these things. Sometimes we don't get it right, sometimes we do. It's the fact about certain things like SUVs. They have impacts, and one can imagine there are millions of SUVs, there are millions, if not billions, of people at risk. One could, if one wanted to, compute some numbers around that. But it's not just remote communities that are affected. This is a photograph of Dunderave in West Vancouver, close to where I live, where the engineers there are working actively to buttress the promenades against sea level rise. So there is a connectivity. The models would suggest that. We can begin to suggest that in ways to people and see if that actually has an effect or is enlightening. But again, that's only part of the picture. We don't want to dwell on the doom and gloom. The psychology tells us that's not the thing to do. The thing to do is to talk about solutions and to combine these things. Yes, explain the problems as accurately and truthfully as we can, but also get into the solutions of mitigation, adaptation, and the fact that these are connected. So where do the elderly fit into this then? I think it's fair to say that our generation and the boomer generation are probably unique in history because we've presided over most of the most radical changes in climate. We're old enough to remember what it was like before climate change really got going, and we're probably going to see a lot more. But we have some idea of what that baseline is, as well as watching, what happens and observing, as Stuart was saying earlier. We are observers, unique observers. So we could argue that we carry a responsibility to tell our stories as accurately as we can and keep a record of the past in the conversation of the present and the future. What low-carbon living was like. It's not just nostalgia. Of course, we all are nostalgic about our youth. Everybody is. But in this case, there's been a major shift that isn't just sort of rose-colored glasses. And we can reframe how people think about it. You'll see stories like this, for example. This came from Georgia Strait the same day that Heather's article came out on Earth Day about the decline of Ulican, the local smelter, the oil-bearing fish. 30 years ago, you could fill your boat in half an hour. Now there are barely any. And one can remember those declines in sort of personal stories. But also the idea that history tells us everybody lived low-carbon lives, right? It was the norm in every culture for millions of years, right? Only in our last generation have we decided we don't want a low-carbon life. So I remember the milk came to my house when I was a kid this way. And it came in bottles that were reused bottles. No hormones in the milk, no carbon in the delivery. Now we have to put our kids in a car, drive them to the supermarket, get it in plastic with hormones. Now, is that progress? I don't know. Okay, I'm getting nostalgic, sorry. I'll move past the nostalgia. But these things are true. They're simply not fashionable to say these kinds of things. But I think as points have been made that as we get older, we do think about legacy, we think about the future, we have become more far-sighted, and we use foresight a little bit more perhaps. And this could make us sort of unlikely champions perhaps. People tend to think of older people being more conservative. There is plenty of evidence for that, but there's also evidence, I want to show a couple of examples of where we have used our activism and our contacts and our time to volunteer for these kinds of things and get things moving. Just 2 slides on one great example that I stumbled on. It wasn't a research project. West Vancouver, of all places, a high elderly population, also a very affluent population by world standards. And it has a problem. It has a problem that people love to live in beautiful houses. Nothing wrong with that except they're huge and they burn a lot of natural gas. And the local people began to sort of rebel against the council because they didn't like the amount of new construction, the massive amount of traffic that was generated. So you can see the numbers here. People were concerned about the character of the neighborhood they're growing old in. And they were running surveys, and a local group bubbled up, grassroots group, bubbled up to try and change policies over housing because they realized that these were not affordable places to grow old in. That there was no housing choice. Single-family homes, period. Big single-family homes. Not a favorable place to grow old in. And so there's now been a movement to bring in secondary suites, things that were illegal until 2 years ago, right? So this was a movement that came from the elderly themselves looking for ways to age gracefully in place. Other examples would be youth, you see, marvelous. Another one from close to where my family has roots in the Cotswolds, but the idea of village shops all over Britain, they're run, staffed, set up by retirees. A very functioning, makes ends meet kind of business and increases resilience of that community. So, how do we look forward into the future and turn some of these benefits that we have as older people into being a motivation for change in the future and help people make better decisions about them? I'm going to talk about this thing that I've nicknamed low carb, but it really stands for low carbon, attractive, resilient communities. It's very like the transition town movement, only perhaps a little more broadly based, that kind of theme. Getting to measurable major reductions in carbon usage, and also keeping the community attractive and quality of life there, identity. We have some issues when we go green. This is an example from New York Times very recently about opposition to solar panels. Okay, all things being equal, yeah, who would really want solar panels all over their neighborhood? But things aren't equal anymore. Some change is going to be inevitable, and we sort of, in a way, have to find some ways to pay for the benefits that we've all accrued, at least those of us that live in more affluent nations, for the past. So this is a big issue. I'm happy to talk your hind leg off about wind turbines and solar panels and people's aesthetic reactions, but no time. And so we do need to adapt to climate change. We need to adapt to the things that come with that and with progress, high energy prices, build better services, improve our health and this kind of thing. So just 2 examples. Electric vehicles. Well, old folks are leaders in electric vehicles. Right? Think about it. Most of them are like that. They're not legal off the golf course. Right? West Vancouver, you can't drive to Park Royal, which is a big shopping mall, in your golf cart. You can drive your golf cart around to recreate, but you've got to jump in your big car or your SUV because the buses aren't very good either. And electric wheelchairs and these kinds of things. There are many alternatives. You don't have to have the smooth Tesla Roadster. This is from a student project, also on a project we did in West Van. The idea of using single-family home gardens as community gardens and renting out space to farmers. There are many of these things in Vancouver now. Sounds like Britain, rather similar. There are ways to increase the resilience and the local activity in your neighborhood through creative use of gardens for food production and this kind of thing. So one of the tools that we've been using has been these kinds of visualizations to show a typical neighborhood, very large homes, very attractive, but in hindsight, not a good place to grow old in. Can't buy milk, can't walk anywhere to do anything other than recreate. Very few sidewalks, there's one there. Pavements for the British and the Europeans here. And these are one-family homes for the most part. Some of them have illegal suites, but we wouldn't want to talk about that. Very wide roads. Okay, so we can think of a very different future. We can think ahead to a whole bunch of things, and this is just a cartoon of many different changes that we could make in our community to make it more resilient, That includes things like stormwater swales for the more intense rainfall that we're already measuring, but a lot of other things, transit, a local shop, maybe a little coffee place where you can go and chat to your mates, or even a pub, for heaven's sake. But anyway, in many of our single-family neighborhoods across North America, the standard way people live, these things are not allowed by law, by local policy. And so we can imagine a whole range of things. And the idea is to have a process and visual media and anything we can do to talk about it to get people thinking, well, I don't want to do that, but I might do this. You know, is this a mechanism to get people to think more about their future, which most people don't do. They don't really think about the future of their block, their neighborhood. So we've been exploring ways to engage with new media. I'm happy to tell you a lot more. I only have a couple of slides on this. We have a manual on a new visioning process that we've been testing with communities called climate change visioning. And there are some ways to obviously interact with communities, to assess the effectiveness of these methods. This is actually in an old folks' home in Delta, where we managed to keep most of the people awake. We actually were counting how many people fell asleep, and we managed with the pictures to keep them awake. When we did it the same thing without pictures, many more fell asleep. That's actually true. A process, I won't go through it, but it does use data and visualization, so there's science behind it, but we're putting it in a form that's easy to understand. So one example, we're working on a case study in Toronto on urban heat island effects. This is a 3D map of part of downtown Toronto, and you can see the green areas with the canopy, and the red area is thermal imaging. The hottest areas are the areas in dark red, overlaid on the 3D buildings. This actually turns out, the bright red one there is actually artificial turf, which turns out to be rather hot in terms of surface temperature. So we can visualize the heat. It doesn't have to be just visible things to help people understand why you might want to keep more street trees. We can flood the homes. Stuart showed a different part of the same series. This is Beach Grove, as is. This is a Delta community in 2100 with sort of a worst-case storm surge. We can think about the adaptation options, diking versus raising the wall. They have pros and cons, or putting houses on stilts, and mitigating at the same time through solar panels. There's many, many more of these, but I just wanted to give you a taste of how those things work, and they do have a fairly major reaction when you show those to the people involved. So what we found, I've just got one slide to summarize, is that we know we can increase awareness of local impacts and local mitigation adaptation options, increased choices, increased capacity, and we can get 60 to 70% of people at least telling us that they will support adaptation and mitigation local policies. We too found great frustration about a lack of local policy, even though Delta in this case was doing reasonably well on adaptation planning. So as I mentioned, we do have a guidance manual. It's free, a website, I'll leave that on at the end, that Ellen Pond and others at CALP worked on. So that's out there as kind of an example. And I wanted to leave you with the thought that we can collaborate with young people who know how to use all these tools. I don't know half the computer tools myself anymore, but the young students that we bring in do, and your kids, my kids, and grandkids are already playing with these things. This is a school project from West Van Science grade 10 class, and they were given this problem. Some of you may recognize this. This is Horseshoe Bay. And this is what the students produced, was one vision of Horseshoe Bay in a greener future. Now, as a scientist, I'd like to sort of, well, maybe the photovoltaic panels should be facing another way. There'd be a whole series of things you'd like to do in a real process. The point is, there are people around who are completely able to visualize this stuff. The technology, the software is not the problem. The problem is, how do we pull the information and the people together to do the kind of translation that Stuart was talking about. So, last slide. So I think some of the action items that I take away from this that maybe resonate with some of the points that we've heard would be that, aging people do have a vital role, a vital responsibility, and a vital opportunity to really be agents of change, to help build a conservation culture, talk about the resilience from the past, and think ahead a little bit better, particularly about aging in place. Most communities do want to age in place. You know that better than I do. But we see it in the real life, and it has caused change in local policy just based on the champions in the aging community. And if we can find a way to get this sort of pincer movement of old folks and young folks coming into city council and passing orders, etc., like, where are they going to go? They can't escape, right? They're coming at you from both ends. So that's really the thoughts I wanted to leave, just to say thank you, and a final plug for the book, of course, so thank you for mentioning that, coming out in September. We invite you all to the SIRS Decision Theatre, which will be opening in November at UBC, so if any of you are around in the fall, we're going to have a place for community access and engagement on issues like climate change. So we hope you'll come and see us. Thank you.
So I would like now to announce our next speaker, Dr. Anastasia Bugeva. is a policy analyst at the Climate Change and Health Office at Health Canada. She has a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Toronto and a PhD degree in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa. She's currently leading the development of the heat alert and response system to protect health. In addition, she co-authored a number of publications, for instance, on communicating the health risks of extreme heat events, the toolkit for public health and emergency management officials. She chaired a communications working group aimed at addressing challenging challenges communicating heat health impacts, and has participated in national and international meetings and workshops on this issue. She regularly provides advice to public health service providers on strategies to set up heat alert and response systems and on best practices to communicate heat health risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the organizers for having us come and speak with you. It's a pleasure to have such a diverse audience with the same view on the climate change and health issues as well as the older adults. I hope I'll be able to add something to your agenda. Can everybody hear me? Yep. Do I need this? I think we need a microphone. Yeah? Yeah, I need it. Okay. Sorry about that. I may go in and out a little bit just because I tend to fidget a little bit. So the title of my presentation is about informed tools to address climate change and related health risks. And specifically what I wanted to talk about is highlight some of the discussions as well as interactions that we've had with the stakeholders in order to develop some of the tools. Specifically, I will talk about the current heat health risk, as well as the future heat health risk. I think a lot of us have already heard about some of it, but I was hoping to introduce a little bit more to you about the issue. I'll talk about some of the methods and collaborations that are available to us to hopefully overcome this challenge, and the informed approach that Health Canada has taken to develop the tools to go forward on this issue, as well as wanted to highlight some of the benefits of the collaborations. So this is an image of Russia, not just 2003 Europe. So this is a slightly different image, but it's from the last year, 2010. And you can see there from the intense burgundy color in the middle of Russia that they've experienced really hot temperatures in the summer of 2010. And as a result of that, close to 55,000 people died, according to the most recent estimates. I'm sure the numbers are going to continue climbing as they look closely to the information. And it's not only because of the heat that the deaths occurred, but also the compounding effects of air quality that people were faced with because of the forest fires that resulted of the drought, as well as the extreme temperature that I'm sure that a lot of people in Vancouver are quite familiar with. So the temperatures were very unusual. They're about 15 degrees higher than the average of temperature of 21 degrees Celsius for the months of August. So putting people at about 36 degrees outside of during the daytime temperatures. This is the image that actually Peter showed earlier about the projections, what Canada is about to experience in the future, as well as what we've experienced. But what I want to bring your attention to is the second graph here. And this particular graph shows the expected temperature increases for the nighttime, which is very important for climate change. So we're not only interested in 30 degrees Celsius hot temperatures, because if it goes cool at night, most people will be able to relieve themselves from the stress of the heat during the day. But if it maintains the really hot temperatures at night, people, especially in the higher apartment buildings, are less likely to, higher floors in the apartment buildings are less likely to get that night relief. So we need to be conscious of that. And a lot of perceptions, I guess, out there is that heat is a future health risk, but it's very important to highlight that in Canada, it is a current health risk. So looking at the mortality curve there of the city of Fredericton, out of all places, so it's not the one that you usually hear about, but you can see that even in the city of Fredericton, as the temperature increases, so does the mortality. So it's very important to look at the information available to you and try to extrapolate to see whether your community is actually at risk from the heat health risk currently. And the other thing that's very important to highlight here is that individuals have the primary role in adaptation. I know that we can put infrastructure for them to go to the cooling places or to go to some of the places where they can get water, but if they don't do it and if they don't go, then we can't do much about it. So it's very important to inform them and actually have them almost buy into it in order for them to take action. So you can see here, this is an image from a newspaper that I took. This is a Russian heat wave again last year. There's a whole bunch of older people sitting under umbrellas. That's a prime example of adaptation, how even though there's no shade, they've pulled out those umbrellas and created shade for themselves. So the next topic that I wanted to talk to you about is the methods that are available to us. They were mentioned here and there throughout the talks that I heard earlier, but I just wanted to bring it all together and highlight that surveillance is very important for us to be able to adapt to climate-related risks. So, for example, for extreme heat events, we do need the weather surveillance, as well as we need mortality surveillance and morbidity. So, for example, some communities in Canada already use that information, the mortality and morbidity 911 calls, as a trigger to issue heat alert warning or extreme heat alert warning, and actually implement some of the actions to help people stay cool and stay hydrated. The other very important one is modeling. I just showed you an image of a graph, actually, of what is to come, but so we need more of those. I think a lot of the questions that we've got from the communities, what about me, what about my communities, how are we going to be impacted by this climate change scenarios? So it's important for us to provide those to them. As well as the modeling of vulnerability. I know that we've done some temperature modeling, but it's important that we also look and see how our demographics are going to change and how people are going to be potentially moving around or maybe growing older, as we've talked about today. One thing that's missing in a lot of emergency response type adaptation actions is the evaluation component. We found that there's little pieces here and there that we can write on, but it's important that people do comprehensive evaluations and see whether the adaptation measures that they're trying to implement are actually being received at the other end and are being implemented. People are visiting cooling centers, and not only visiting cooling centers, but actually the right people are visiting cooling centers who you're trying to reach with your cooling centers. It's also very important to assess the adaptation needs as part of the evaluation procedure to identify the barriers to actions that you individuals you're targeting are facing. There's a number of collaborations that you almost have to have in place in order to prepare yourself for the climate change. I'll specifically talk a little bit more about extreme heat events, but I'm sure is quite transferable. one major group of collaborations is to address research gaps. So I've talked about modeling. We need meteorological data in order to do that. So there's a number of gaps there that could be addressed in, for example, improvements to weather forecasts and the methods used to forecast them, the lack of humidex forecast, in order for community to actually be able to adapt some of that more physiological component in their alerting states. Emergency preparedness, I'm sure there's tons of research gaps that could be addressed there. Public health, who is the vulnerable people, why are they vulnerable, how can we help them not be vulnerable anymore, if the word vulnerable is the right term to use. I'm sure there's many other terms that we can use there. With respect to implementation of the adaptation gaps, there's a number of things that need to be addressed when you working with your stakeholders or collaborators. You need to look whether they address an existing need, whether they bring to the table required networks, contribute valuable experience and expertise to enhance the function of the program. It's important to take on a role of being a liaison between their organization as well as the organization that you're trying to link with them. Also, whether they already cater to vulnerable groups. I know that people who already cater to older adults, they have a much better understanding of that particular group than those who don't, so they'll be able to bring that to the table. Also have existing plans and protocols that have the capacity to develop them as well as adapt them to the needs, and are able to increase capacity. And all of these could be, I guess, listed as your potential stakeholders, as well as you could analyze them based on your needs, whether they actually have a place in your emergency response, and develop a plan to actually engage them. As you engage them, there's a number of questions that you may need to be conscientious about. These particular questions were the ones that we were faced with as we were engaging our communities in setting up heat alert and response systems. So for example, why develop a heat alert and response system right now, and why take action on heat over other hazards? So those are all the questions you need to face. What about public messages? Which messages should we use if we only have the capacity to deliver 3 messages during an emergency? Which ones should those be? How will HARS be maintained over long term? We don't have the capacity to maintain an alert system in place over a long term. So all of those need to be anticipated. As well as you have to be very conscientious about some of the challenges that they're faced with. So for example, limited human and financial resources, especially if they're volunteer organizations. Conflict in priorities of public health and emergency management, especially if you have an outbreak of some sort or another emergency. Engaging and maintaining interests of stakeholders is also very important to factor in. Coordinating different stakeholders, as well as municipal departments in a level of government, is always a challenge, as we've heard earlier as well. And also planning for safe involvement of volunteers who could comprise of older adults. We've heard that they have a number of unique challenges and vulnerabilities, especially when it comes down to extreme heat events. So you want to make sure that you address their needs if they're going to be part of your response system. So this is just for your information, a structure that it was developed by the City of Toronto with some of their stakeholders. So you can see the medical officer of health, public health, city planners, community partners were all involved, as well as some additional partners that are involved at the municipal as well as non-government organization level in other communities that we've been dealing with, home care, Meals on Wheels, Canadian Red Cross. So the informed approach to setting up heat alert and response system that our office has taken required a number of consultations, collaborations, setting up advisory committees. Glenn Kenny, who is sitting there, as well as Tom Kozetsky, who was here earlier, were all part of this process. We also set up 4 pilot communities. I'm referring to them as pilot just because it was already introduced earlier. They're not pilot anymore, but they've been around, I guess, for a couple of years. There are 4 communities, one in Manitoba in Winnipeg. The other one is in Manitoba in the Assiniboine Regional Health Authority, which is a rural community in Manitoba. We also have Windsor, Ontario on board, as well as Fredericton in New Brunswick. Like I said, it required a lot of consultations, not only with the pilot communities and their stakeholders, but as well as consultations with other municipalities, including Vancouver, Kingston, Toronto, Montreal, and it required extensive literature review because we wanted to make sure that our recommendations were based on some scientific knowledge. So this here, what you see is the first document that our office released. It's Communicating Health Risks of Extreme Heat Events, Toolkit for Public Health and Emergency Management Officials. Originally, we didn't have the plans to develop this document. But what we found through our consultations is that that's exactly what people needed, and early on in the process to set up heat alert system, because the questions came up: what are the scientifically accurate messages? What should we say to the communities as well as our stakeholders? So we've developed those, as well as we developed, in using this particular toolkit, we developed a series of fact sheets. And with help from EPA, we were able to actually make sure that they resonate with other communities as well, and are tailored to the needs of the audience. So you can see the older adults as well as physically active and parents with young children were the ones that we chose to develop first, but we're hoping to have them evaluated, and we have our ears to the ground, listening to what people like, what people don't like about them, and we will be definitely revisiting them throughout the process. We also developed, we looked at the perceptions of climate change related risks in Canada, and what we found that air pollution was seen by Canadians as high risk and high impact, but heat waves, as you can see, it was low risk, low impact, so we had a lot of work to do. As well as in perceptions of heat health risks in the population, you can see that some people are very confused about the messages that are out there. Some people say shut all the doors and draw all the curtains. Other people say open everything. So people need to be guided through this process. So what we were able to distill out from our consultations and our work with the partners is a number of essential actions that people have to take to protect health during extreme heat events. Particularly, you can see that stay cool and hydrated. You can't argue with that. You need to do that during an extreme heat event. But there's also preparing for extreme heat events. So talking to your practitioner, if you are on medications, to find out if the medications you're taking is actually could put you at a higher risk than if you weren't taking them. Know the signs and symptoms of heat health impacts, as well as know community-appropriate options that are available out there. So this is Toronto. They opened cooling center, and this is the sign they put outside of it. So if you didn't know that cool down here sign meant that this is a cooling center, you were very unlikely to wander in there. So it's important that you inform yourself as well as you get informed about these options. There's many other appropriate programs and services that are out there. We've talked about commuting. Having access to public transportation. We've talked about staying physically active and hydrated. We've talked about access to air conditioning, as well as providing the services to those in need. We talked about the need for visitation and building those social networks with your community partners, as well as your caregiver if you have one, and also the need to potentially alter your food during extreme heat event, that you probably shouldn't be eating that soup if you can avoid it, and maybe salad may be a better choice. Also, it's crucial to identify co-benefits and adaptation options. As all of us, I'm sure, agree here that by putting in a bike lane and taking cars off the street, as many as you can, you're not only impacting the greenhouse gas emissions, you're also going to impact the health of those who are commuting. By building social networks, you're going to develop a number of benefits. I don't even know where to start or where to end. Also, the urban sprawl was mentioned earlier. It's very important that we look at it and see whether our people who we're trying to target are part of the urban sprawl. Of course, identify opportunities to integrate your messages, as well as challenges of intercommunication campaigns where there is potential for conflicting messages. So use air conditioners and fans, don't use air conditioners and fans. Open windows, close windows. So these are all the things that you need to address during your communications campaign. And of course, the EPA is there, making sure that we're all aligned as much as we can across the board with our messages, and of course having them tailored to the audience that you're trying to reach with those messages is crucial. And if you have any questions, thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take them at the end or during dinner today. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Larry Frank. He's a property shareholder in sustainable transportation at the University of British Columbia in the School of Population and Public Health, and a senior resident fellow of the Brookings Institution. He specializes in the interaction between land use, travel behavior, air quality, and health. Larry has been studying the effects of neighborhood walkability on travel patterns and sustainability for over 20 years. He has led and co-authored over 100 papers and 2 books on public health. He and his colleagues have also been conducting detailed assessments of fuel consumption and climate change impacts of urban form policies. Over the past decade, Larry has been working directly with local governments to help translate results from this research into practice-based tools that can provide direct feedback on the health and environmental impacts of alternative transportation and land development. Please, Larry.
Good afternoon. Is everyone awake? Okay. I overate lately, so I'm eating less, and I'm finding that that's making me tired. So I'm going to talk a bit about, I'm curious, the theme on the aging, it's not really as much on aging as it is on, I guess I'm trying to figure out, a lot of the work that I do is like 2 tracks, and they're interrelated. One is the environmental impacts of the way we design communities, and then the other is the health impacts of the way we build communities, and the 2 are completely interrelated. And I love that you designed this to look at the nexus between the 2 as related to elderly. And as I'm sitting here reflecting on that connection, I guess there's certain exposures that I'm hearing, certainly heat exposure, other things could happen where we have energy, not enough energy, could be more sensitive for elder in Canada. It might even be that there's not enough heat at times, and seniors may be more vulnerable in that way. I was just thinking about transportation, access to services, where we age, and the whole notion that I heard about aging in place being discussed a bit ago, and the notion that aging in place is a really good thing. And a lot of the research that we're doing shows that a lot of the places people are aging is actually not a good thing. So in fact, aging in place, it's like aging and place. And then the question is, I guess I've been thinking about this, is place people define as their home. But if we were to learn to define place as community, the area, the spatial context, which I'll be talking about a little bit more, that might actually help us solve some of the problems we have, because the communities we've designed are fairly homogeneous in terms of dwelling type and land use type. They're single use, pretty much, typically more auto-dependent than they need to be, although not in all places. But if in fact there was a variety of different housing types within an area, and we had the ethos, the mental kind of conception of place, meaning we're now moving to a different point in life, and we are now no longer needing our single-family home, but we want to remain part of our community. There is another type of housing in the community to accommodate us so that you don't lose that social fabric. And I just sort of was thinking about all these things as we've been doing some work on healthy aging, and I wanted to start off with those observations. So I just get right into it here. I guess I put my presentation together today for you and just jump right into the built environment part. It was really great to hear Stephen Shepard speak, and I think we need to get together and have lunch more often. He's a planner and landscape architect, so am I, and we're probably 4 buildings away and see each other once every 4 years. So proximity, we are proximate, so we should try to meet up. A little bit on the kind of the mechanisms of the research. Let's talk about, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the relationship between neighborhood design and health outcomes, then the climate impacts, and I'll try to wrap up with some of that if I have a moment at the end. So the kinds of, on the research side, what a lot of the work that I do and my colleagues do are really focused on comparative work, often cross-sectional because we've lacked having longitudinal data, although Heather's working on a Canadian longitudinal study of elderly that will be really interesting and exciting, and there are more and more longitudinal studies coming along. A household located in a neighborhood like this can get to within a kilometer out the door of their house. If this is your house, this line defines basically your behavior shed within about a kilometer. For an elderly person, that may be about as far as they want to walk or can walk. It could even be smaller. The question that we've been looking at is what is the right geographic scale to study the relationship between environments and behavior for elderly and health impacts and perhaps climate impacts, travel, whatever, is probably smaller than for us, most of us. The idea here is this is a 1 kilometer network buffer. Here's a crowfly buffer. This household could be in any kind of survey or recruited into any sort of data collection effort or just observing the household. Over here, the buffer's bigger. The road network is connected. That's because of the road network being connected, you can get to more of what you could think of the crowfly buffer, the straight line, the spherical radial buffer as a pie, and sort of the crowfly, the network buffer, sort of how much of the pie can you actually get to. You can get to more if you have a connected environment. But also, if you have a variety of different land uses, then of course you have complementarity or proximity. So proximity is a function of density and mix, and then connectivity is sort of if stuff's nearby, can you actually get to it? Pretty intuitive. So what we typically do a lot of is build up at the parcel level. We're doing a new one. We have a 2005 surface for Vancouver, have built these sorts of data sets in many regions of North America at this point. I think we haven't done Edmonton yet, in Calgary in Canada, but we're moving across Canada now, and it creates a way to, by having a surface across a whole region like we have in Vancouver, you can start to see when you put together a variety of measures. And for example, all this discussion on walkability that's evolved over the last decade has been actually silent and blind to the presence of sidewalks. Believe it or not, our walkability measures have not had sidewalks in them until now because we haven't had good sidewalk data. We haven't been able to get it. You'd actually have to walk around every single street and know if it's there or not. Now we have detailed enough aerial imagery, the resolution is great enough that we can automate and actually build sidewalk layers remotely as long as there's not too much vegetation. In Vancouver, here's an image just showing walkability and postal codes. In the Canadian context, we know is about a block face, but we build a network buffer around every single postal code. So now there's a tool, and it could be used for any survey that anybody had in Vancouver. We've got one for Baltimore, one for Seattle, one for Portland, one for, I don't know, San Diego, and so forth. So any sort of existing data set that you can get address information, you can actually now correlate, and look at what the relationship is between the design of a neighborhood. So it's a tool better than building observation-specific buffers if you have a sample and just saying, well, we got 1,600 people, we'll build buffers around them. That's a one-off. It does good for that study. Better to have a tool and a surface, so that's typically how we do it. I only mention it because there might be opportunities for collaboration and figuring out ways to use it. One example of a way to use it, I'll show some measures here and then show one example of the way we use it here. So here's an example of 2 neighborhoods in Vancouver in the Metro Lower Mainland area. One is called Uptown Moody Park. It's in New West. It's fairly walkable. You can see we have net residential density, which is dwellings per acre, mixed use. There's lots of ways to measure mixed use. We use an index from 0 to 1, which is an entropy measure. Basically looks at the evenness of distribution of square footage of use across different types of use. So if you've got 100,000 square feet in your little crowfly or your little network buffer, and it's evenly distributed across, you got an equal amount of housing and an equal amount of employment and an equal amount of institutional and an equal amount of retail, it's equal all across, theoretically saying you're mixed as you could be. We don't really know if that's the best recipe for mix. It's like soup, is that the right amount of potatoes relative to broth, and maybe you need a little more chicken in there, whatever. We don't really know. But one thing we know is just having broth or just potatoes is probably not as good. So we're analogously trying to have complementarity, but functional complementarity is different. And typically using this to predict utilitarian travel, getting places for purpose. Not so good yet at predicting recreational and leisure time travel, which is really important for elderly and really important for youth. So bringing in the recreational amenities, understanding access to parks and open space, perhaps that relates directly with the cooling effect. Certainly Frederick Law Olmsted knew that 150 years ago when he designed Central Park, that was one of the main things he wrote. So cooling is critical. I know from Arizona it's about 15 degrees cooler under a tree than out in the sun. I was just there. So so intersection density, connectivity, you can just see little images and figure ground maps. One of the interesting measures I'll mention that you may not hear much about is one that in Canada we call retail floor space ratio. Every single piece of land is zoned for how much square footage of space you can put on it. It's a legal thing. We buy a piece of land. You can, when in Vancouver you go past your limit, they could actually make you remove an addition you add on. So that floor space ratio is really important, and what this tells us is that when you have a buffer that if your neighborhood has a lot of retail floor space relative to land area in retail use, it means probably that the retail is set up to the curb, like along this street here, and that if you were using transit, you can walk right in and out of shops as opposed to having a lot of surface parking. So this is a proxy for surface parking, and we see when we compare neighborhoods, we sort of rank them, and people don't like it when we do that. So we typically just show some examples. We're publishing a report right now with Metro Vancouver and TransLink and other agencies in the region, and this is coming up because it's sort of, can you find an example where you don't make X neighborhood look bad? I just presented in San Diego a Healthy Communities Atlas where we mapped all of these indicators, and immediately the ire, everybody wants to be walkable now. I guess we should have done this 10 years ago before it was cachet to be walkable. So one of the things that we've done is we've conflated all of the demographic information in the region to the census, to the walkability data. So that makes it really useful because now we're able to look at where populations are relative to where access to opportunities are or where it's walkable. So we can actually ask questions like how many people over the age of 65 are in neighborhoods that aren't particularly walkable, do not have access to transit. We could even query the data to say where do you have greater than X percentage or X number of women over the age of 65 who are of an income level less than X. So you can actually start, because it's census data, so you can cut and slice it any way you want, and actually start to look at distributions of where you've got potential problems. And it looks like, without looking at the demographic on the income side, that we've got quite a bit in North and West Vancouver. So that's actually interesting. There's a lot of seniors there, and it's not particularly walkable relative to our measures, but it might be very walkable for recreation and leisure. There's a lot of amenity there. But in terms of the ability to walk to a store, it may be kind of difficult. We might want to add to our index, and we are now in the U.S. using altimeters. We're actually capturing slope, but we could certainly just bring in the topographic information and add to this for elderly. So we're now facing, and this just shows, you're all the experts on this, but I'm just showing you some information. Changing demographics. California, for example, we'll see its 65 plus population more than double in the next quarter of a century, from 3.5 to 8.2 million people. Where will they live? Well, one thing we're learning is that elderly want to live where there's access to services, less reliance on driving and maintaining, while being able to maintain independence. So undergirding a lot of this rise in land value in the more walkable places is, of course, and you're just on the front end of it, aging baby boomer population. I guess I'm the very sort of towards the tail end of it, but I'm still in there. I just turned 50, so I feel like I'm ready to retire. So for elderly, this is a really important thing. Considering aging in place, is key. Seattle's no different. In fact, a projection was made that's now this year. I've had this slide for a while. A population in 2000 and 2011 on the right, you can see elderly are really quickly populating and moving towards more central areas. Of course, energy costs are also driving the price and land value up. So here in Vancouver, we have, as we know, an affordable housing. We don't have affordable housing. We just have a crisis. They call it the affordable housing crisis, and the crisis is that there isn't any. It's really gotten to be quite crazy. In fact, we recently hosted a forum on this issue and brought in a colleague of mine from Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago to talk about location-efficient mortgage lending. Some of you may be aware that when you buy a house, there's no factor in the mortgage that captures how much you spend on transportation, yet your transportation cost varies considerably based on where you live. So the idea is to bring that in. And we thought about it after a while and realized that would be probably one of the worst things we could possibly do in Vancouver. In Atlanta, where I used to live, it would be perfect because it would basically allow people to borrow more money where they spend less on transportation in the more central areas. So basically in Vancouver, that would actually create more market for more demand in the more central areas. So we have to be careful. So I'm going to jump past this because I'm actually only a third of the way through my talk and I ran out of time. This is Atlanta. You might have seen it. And actually just going to get into some results. We've done a couple studies. One in Atlanta. We're collecting a lot of data now currently in Seattle and Baltimore. This was from a previous study in Atlanta. We had 1,970 people, 65 and older. It was a travel survey, 2 days. We had decent sample size, as you see. And we looked at travel mode, trip purpose, time of day over 2 days for them. And they provided information on their demographics, height and weight. This is one of the only travel surveys. We just finished one in Waterloo, and we're trying to do one here now where we actually get people in travel surveys to give us their height and their weight and to tell us a little bit about their preferences for different types of neighborhoods and so forth. Basically, I've got to skip this to get to this results. I'm just going to summarize in the interest of time. Increased walkability was related. This is published now in the Journal of Physical Activity and Health. It's a published paper about a year ago. Increased walkability was related with more walking, less time spent in cars. You can read the odds ratios, the likelihoods, and lower odds of being overweight, not so much obese. Those with one or no cars were more likely to walk and spend less time in cars, but also less likely to get recommended levels of physical activity. Having a car is positively associated in Atlanta with getting the amount of physical activity you need, which is actually makes sense because you've got to drive somewhere to get physical activity because most of the neighborhoods people live in don't support the activity in their own community. Visiting a fast food outlet was associated with increased odds of obesity. And some other results is age, number of cars, ethnicity, and walkability were significantly related to walking at least once over the 2-day period. Only 4% of the samples, I shouldn't even want to have to say it, reported they walked. 57% of the sample were overweight and 20% obese. Those with one or no car were almost 3 times more likely to walk. Those with a college degree were almost twice as likely to walk. There is a lot of evidence on educational attainment effect independent of income, as you know, in this type of research. And those living in highly walkable neighborhoods were 2 times more likely to walk than low walkable. So we do see a relationship. And just finally, really important on the study of elderly is the breaking apart of the age ranges because from 65 to 70 is totally different. We have 2 observational studies underway in the U.S. and another one starting here. And this is something that I've been really keen on focusing is to really study they're almost different populations. I guess they are, and you probably would instruct me that maybe I should break them apart into more groups. I don't know. So the youngest group and those with a higher household income and a degree were more likely to travel in a car. Makes sense. Those with one or less didn't have a car, non-whites and women were significantly less likely to spend an hour a day in a car. Time spent in cars is actually a really important predictor. We've shown in previous studies, the study showing driving makes you fat. You might have heard where each additional hour in a car is associated with an additional 6% likelihood of obesity for the general population. And for seniors, it's not much different. So it's a good way to generate greenhouse gas emissions and also the sedentary behavior associated with it. Those living in neighborhoods with medium walkability were 35% less likely, and those in highly walkable neighborhoods even less likely to have over a day in a car. So only those with a car were significantly more likely to meet. However, we've got a conundrum because then you need a car to get recommended activity levels. So I want to just wrap up and say we do have some results on obesity. Fairly limited, but on overweight, not obesity. And those who walk were significantly less likely to be overweight, and we know that's, of course, very tied to the design of the neighborhoods where they live. And then, women and those with a degree were less likely to be overweight. So I want to ask if I can just mention one thing, which is that, actually, a couple things. One is, first, air pollution exposure in elderly is a critical issue. I'm sure some of you may have spoken about this earlier. I assume so. I've been working with Mike Brower at UBC and Julian Marshall, another colleague, and we took the air pollution exposure information that Mike had generated and just spatially matched it with the walkability data, and this is published in Environmental Health Perspectives, came out about a year ago. Walkability and air pollution exposure, especially nitric oxide, which is a marker for particulates, is correlated in an extremely high level in certain locations. So we're kind of in a situation that we have to be pretty careful. So this is the one sort of solve one problem and create another, and we're likely to be doing that in this instance. So setback from roadway edge is, the good news is probably, I don't know, was this covered? Okay, so this is really air pollutants, the particulates that are so strongly noted in the literature as being triggers for myocardial infarction are leach out of the air really quickly from roadway edge. So the good news is it's really concentrated corridors, and you're looking at truck movement, goods movement, and logistics, and actually having to have more of a comprehensive plan. And I hope that the elderly, the issue about healthy aging, and Kathy might know a whole lot about this, I know she does, is that it's really it's a bit of an Achilles heel if you don't. I decided to study this head on because I was afraid. We have a couple of folks like Randall O'Toole and Wendell Koch. These are folks in the U.S. who are constantly, anytime we do a study showing that walkability and sustainable approaches to development are good, they come up with another study showing, well, that's ridiculous, it has nothing to do with the physical environment. And so I just wanted to do this head on because we can solve this problem fairly, not easily, but reasonably through some careful planning, having cleaner vehicles running in more central areas, actually separating the type of housing that goes close to the street, setting housing back a little bit. Density doesn't need to be right along the major corridors, and in fact 3 stories up from street level the emissions are much lower. So density is actually our friend in effect, and elderly may, in fact, siting of elderly facilities and housing really has to be thoughtfully done relative to where emissions are greatest. Thank you.
So it's my pleasure to welcome our last speaker in this session. So we have Jennifer Pouliot. I hope I got that right.
Oh, that was great.
Jennifer is a climate change adaptation advisor with the Climate Action Secretariat in the BC government's Ministry of Environment, where she contributes to providing cross-government leadership to achieve BC's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and prepare for climate change impacts. Prior to joining the Climate Action Secretariat, Jennifer worked on the socio-economic components of environmental impact assessment with Golder Associates and on climate change adaptation and international development with the United Nations Institute of Training and Research in Geneva. She has got a master's degree in geography from the University of Guelph. Please.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Well, I have the task of being the last speaker for today, so hopefully I can keep you all engaged. I am not familiar with this topic. When I got invited, I was curious as to what I would talk about. I have to admit that today I've learned a whole deal about the issue, and it's been a really great experience. So what I've been asked to talk about today is a little bit sort of a high-level overview of what the provincial government policy is on impacts on adaptation. But I also want to talk about government action in a much broader sense. And after that, I'll really dig deeper into the adaptation policy, particularly related to BC government's climate change adaptation strategy. So, I think this message has been repeated over and over again today. Climate action requires both dealing with greenhouse gas emissions as well as adjusting what we do to avoid negative impacts and take advantage of opportunities. Sometimes mitigation and adaptation actions are neutral to each other. Other times they can actually work at cross purposes to each other, and I think we need to be cognizant of that. But I think particularly in the health sector, there's a lot of examples in the middle where these two things have a lot of synergies with each other and there's a lot of co-benefits. And BC's approaches to climate action both reflect actions for reducing our greenhouse gas reductions and adaptation. So just a little bit about our climate action plan. As a lot of you probably know, the BC government is committed to reducing our carbon emissions by 33% below 2007 levels by 2020. The Climate Action Plan also includes a wide range of initiatives designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in every sector of the province's economy. We also have North America's first revenue-neutral carbon tax. And the BC government is taking the lead by committing to a carbon-neutral government. And so this is all about leadership. BC can't solve the global crisis on our own, but we can be a leader in this area. By taking risks, demonstrating success, and showing that a low-carbon economy is possible and sustainable, we can have influence that's much greater than our province. And we're also working very closely with local governments across British Columbia to find ways to tackle the challenges posed by climate change, pledging to significantly reduce our emissions. And this is a lot about creating complete, compact, more energy-efficient communities. And we also have BC's climate change adaptation strategy. This is what it looks like. It's a very short little document. If you want a copy, I have a few, but it's also available on our website. And it was publicly released in 2007, and it's a very high-level framework. I like to think of it as a first step rather than a comprehensive action plan on adaptation, and it's intended to provide some structure around government's initial response to managing the unavoidable impacts of climate change. So there's three threads in the strategy. The first thread aims to ensure that the best available information and tools are provided to decision makers. And it also includes some things around communication and outreach. The second thread of the strategy aims to encourage and enable adaptive practices in all levels of the BC government. So this is all about mainstreaming, which we've also heard today a little bit. And the desired outcome is that adaptation thinking permeates through government in our decision making where it makes sense for it to do so. And the third thread involves working directly with sectors known to be sensitive to climate change. And the Secretariat's role in this, I don't think of us necessarily always as the doers. I mean, we're a small group of people, and we're not the experts. I'm not a health expert, for instance, but we are enablers and facilitators of climate action in British Columbia. So, CAS can support climate action. We can facilitate building networks. We can help with knowledge transfer, and we can provide an enabling environment within government to help with mainstreaming. So the next slides are going to speak a little more detail to these three, and I'm going to just pull out some examples to really ground what these themes might mean. So the government has taken substantial action to provide knowledge and tools to help decision makers, and the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions has been, I believe, mentioned once. They're actually a funder of the conference. The BC government provided $94.5 million endowment to PICS at the University of Victoria, and it's a network of universities within British Columbia undertaking research on sort of viable mitigation and adaptation options. And the part of that endowment also supports PCIC. So that's called the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. And that provides regional scale climate projections for BC stakeholders, including BC Hydro, local governments, provincial ministries. So the map that you see on the side of the screen, that comes from PCIC. And we're also enhancing our meteorological observation networks to improve the provincial ability to monitor and respond to changing weather. So, for example, ministries of environment, transportation, and what's now the Ministry of Forests, Lands, and Natural Resource Operations, has signed an agreement with other partners like BC Hydro and Alcan in a recognition that there's a potential for adding value if we sort of collaborate and share our networks through cooperation. And the idea is that a lot of this historical information will eventually be housed in one location. And we're also, Environment Canada, who's sort of our federal partners in this work, is also at the table. And then the adaptation strategy also commits to continuing supporting organizations that work with decision makers to help them prepare for climate change, incorporating adaptation concepts and actions into outreach programs. And we've got a whole different number of mechanisms that we use to reach out to people. And one of the things that I've been thinking about when I got invited to this conference is the tools that we use to do these things. Right now at the Secretariat, we're talking a lot about online social media tools and how we use those to reach out to people who are acting, some of the decision makers on climate action, but also other people who we're trying to engage on this. And you know, are these the right tools? Are we missing a huge segment of the population through these tools? And, you know, we need to, you know, hearing people like talking about the Suzuki elders and other people, we've got potentially a very valuable untapped resource of climate champions within British Columbia that maybe we're not engaging with as much as we could. I think there's a huge opportunity here, and so that's something that I've been thinking about. The strategy also recognizes within the provincial government that the relevance of adaptation varies from provincial ministry to provincial ministry. Ministries are at different stages in identifying and addressing climate change and its impacts. And there's a variety, ministries vary in their capacities as well to act on this issue. So some of the common themes within the adaptation strategy is that all ministries should develop an understanding of if and how climate change may impact their business. This fiscal year, if you go to each ministry's service plan, all ministries have now made a commitment to adaptation in their service plan, which I think is a big step forward. And I've thrown up just a couple examples of mainstreaming within provincial government. For example, Living Water Smart is BC's water plan, and it addresses climate change and things like water conservation, watershed planning, enhanced riparian areas, design standards for buildings and flood protection. We're also working with the BC Ministry of Natural Resource Operations in developing new guidelines for sea dikes and coastal developments. So these are some of the examples of how ministries are incorporating climate change into work that they're already doing and they're already acting on. The last one I want to touch on is a commitment that we made in the strategy to do sectoral assessments. And the assessment process is designed to engage government and other stakeholders. And the approach for every sector is going to vary based on needs, their capacities, and the institutional arrangements with the people that we're working with. I've put up some examples of some of the assessment things that you would call assessment-like things, for lack of a better word, up on the screen. We heard about the PIVC process from Stuart very early on in the day. the Ministry of Transportation is working with Engineers Canada through the PI-VC process on an assessment of provincial infrastructure vulnerability. The Ministry of Forests and Range, through what they called the Future Forest Ecosystem Initiative, evaluated climate change impacts on key forest and range values, reviewed some management policies in light of climate change, and out of that process are now investing in research to fill some of the knowledge gaps that they identified through that process. So that's a couple of examples of assessments. As opportunities arise, we want to undertake more and more of these, or support more of these where people are doing it anyways. And I think that sort of taking a look at the health sector is a bit of a gap in British Columbia and potentially an opportunity to move forward a little bit. So this is a bit of repetition from what we've heard today, but I think, age-friendly cities can be climate-friendly cities, and vice versa. We have, throughout the discussion, we've seen a lot of sort of synergies and commonalities. For instance, Kathy, you talked about emissions reductions, generating environmental and health benefits. We talk about, compact communities where people are able to walk to all the resources that they need. Strengthening people's ability to cope with stress through reduced isolation. These are all things that have a lot of synergies with each other. I think effective climate change strategies on climate action depend also, however, on the social acceptance of those options. So actions will need to take into account an understanding not only of the form and function of communities, so not just how we design communities, but also an understanding of place, the local networks, what influences people's behaviors, and all through the day we've touched on all these things, so I kind of feel like I'm the broken record of the conference, which is actually kind of nice. It's great to hear these messages over and over again. Building resiliency needs to start sort of with an understanding of vulnerable populations. And we need to continue to explore potential interactions between these two lines of research and policy development to find practical solutions to the problems, harmonize the need to respond to climate change with the needs of an aging population. So there's lots of opportunities here. And, I think BC's considers itself a leader on climate action. And talking to people on this file, I've heard now that BC is also a leader in the age-friendly file, which is great. And I think but a lot of work remains to be done, and the conversations with those two groups, I think, need to be strengthened as we move forward. So the overall approach and framework, I think, is conducive to facilitating and advancing action on adaptation and collaboration. And, types of forums like this are, have really, moved that discussion forward. And I just want to mention that one of the sort of outcomes that happened because of this conference that, wasn't a planned outcome is because of this conference, my colleague Danielle, who's actually sitting back there, she used to work for the BC Senior Secretariat and now works for the Climate Action Secretariat. So because this conference happened, last week we actually had our first meeting with the Senior Secretariat and the Climate Action Secretariat to really talk to each other about what we're doing and where those commonalities are and how we can start supporting each other and where are the common messages. So I think that's a really great outcome with what's been going on. So thank you.
I want to point out that we have a seniors public representative that will be hearing from at the conference. So
excellent.
We're getting to
Thank you.
So Deborah Harford, she's executive director of the Simon Fraser University's Adaptation to Climate Change Team, or ACT. Deborah is responsible for development of the initiative's pioneering vision and its unique partnerships with the public and private sectors, as well as overall coordination and management of the program. Deborah directs and produces ACT's pioneering policy recommendations for effective adaptation strategies at all levels of government and is responsible for communication and promotion of the program's outcomes. So Deborah, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Heather. This has been an extremely interesting day. I'm sorry I missed this morning, and even sorrier now that I've heard all the very interesting stuff that's gone on this afternoon. I just want to open quickly with the comment that ACT did a report for the Federal Policy Research Initiative, which was published last year, on linkages between climate change adaptation and social policy, and in which we identified 7 major climate impacts that we analysed in terms of policy, and that 4 of those, heat waves, severe storms, wildfires, and shifting ecosystems and pests, seniors are one of the most vulnerable populations. And I think we can see that climate change basically exacerbates the urgency to act on problems that already exist. And we identified a number of key things that policy could help with. And as the title of this session was on innovation and collaboration and how we inform policy and practice, I just want to look quickly at, we looked at the fact that seniors would respond better to active approaches rather than passive approaches such as leaflets, buddy systems, home visits, daily calls. That geospatial decision support systems could be helpful in terms of better understanding of the distribution of vulnerable populations, their locations, and would help with targeting of services. That collaboration on an interdisciplinary and interagency level would be helpful. Et cetera, et cetera. So I think we can bring some of those down to the very interesting talks that our speakers have given us today. And I just want to start with a question from me and then put it out to all of you guys in terms of what kinds of collaboration could the panel think about or perhaps suggest in terms of things like, for instance, Stephen's visualizations, perhaps informing things like warning systems or the kinds of networks that seniors might use. How could those be tailored? The walkability part was very interesting too. I imagine in an emergency, North Vancouver looks pretty walkable on there, but it's not that great for seniors because it's like this. So, there's I'm sure there's different levels of these maps that could be produced. So what role can practitioners in government play in providing better resources like this for seniors in emergencies? Just put that out to any of you guys in terms of collaboration? Was it too complicated a question? Sorry.
You're inquiring about sort of different institutional arrangements between, I think a lot of it's starting. We're seeing, I think, cross-sectoral, having a climate secretariat with healthy aging or seniors is really good, and I'm really interested in how transportation investment can be brought forward as a mechanism to sort of bridge the different disciplines, because right now our investment in transportation and the way the regional growth strategy is under siege again, here. Lots of different critique about how taking our region for example, is growing, and I think applying metrics that are measurable, performance measures, and using those for how transportation investments will impact access to services for elderly, but all populations, and actually really having some feedback, because the investments that are being made in transportation are often not in alignment with anything to do with hitting an 80% reduction by 2050. In fact, if anything, some of them are sending us in the other direction.
Right.
So with that, I'll open up the question.
Yeah.
Maybe I could just add to that. I mean, we certainly see lots of examples, exactly what Lara just mentioned. The issue, for example, in Kimberley and in the Kootenays area, the local municipality signs up to sort of a plan to cut its carbon emissions, but its entire land use plan is in completely the opposite direction, because it's single-family homes out in the forest areas, which is an increasing risk to forest fires, and is not walkable for seniors to anything other than recreation, which is important, but not enough, right? So I think you see those kind of conflicts all the time, and it happens between, inside government units, or between silos within a government unit, municipal level, between the different government levels, sort of all over the place, I think.
Well, I think it kind of speaks to the importance of shared learning amongst groups, and sort of having a forum to learn about sort of their sort of intended outcomes that they're working towards, and sort of identify those areas where there's synergies, but where there might be trade-offs, or we might be working at cross purposes. And I think one of the important parts, just getting back to Deborah's also broader question of collaboration, is around this idea of knowledge transfer. There's a lot of information out there. I'm speaking from my climate change adaptation hat on. There's a huge, huge amount of information. There's a lot of tools and guidebooks and all sorts of stuff out there, and it can be almost overwhelming, and it may not be translated to the communities that you're actually trying to target. So whether we support those boundary organizations that can support that knowledge transfer to make that information useful, and that it's a process of shared learning. So it's not a linear process, but we're all sort of talking and informing the research and information from the very beginning.
Thank you. And if I may add to that, one thing that we need to be conscious about is using some of the tools that are out there and making sure that they're actually applicable to your community. So if you take something developed by WHO, I'm sure it has a lot of great information in there, but we just have to apply it conscientiously to, I guess, at a community level, as well as when something comes from a federal level. The documents that were developed, we've been very conscious to actually develop it as best practices, as this is their array of tools that you may want to consider when you're developing an emergency response plan, rather than these are the actions that you need to take, as well as the literature that we've referenced in a lot of the material is we've selected it specifically to be relevant for the Canadian context, and filtered out as much as we could where it was not relevant.
Thank you. I'll just put this out to the floor then.
Just to support Jennifer's messaging for the provincial government, a couple of comments on your initial question on collaboration. I think within provincial governments, there's a couple of different levels of collaboration. Initially, there's the real easy wins, where things like the Seniors Healthy Living Secretariat has worked really hard to create a seniors network. So they have a seniors.bc.ca portal, and they have a newsletter that goes out quarterly. So in our discussions that we've had, why not put something climate related? So this is already going out to a group of seniors. On the other hand, Seniors Healthy Living Secretariat is trying to get out into local communities, and the Climate Action Secretariat has already established a network through the signing of the, help me out Jennifer, the Community Climate Charter, where there's almost 200 municipalities that have signed it. So if there's events that are happening, why not have some senior messaging? Then to bring it up at a higher level that maybe will take a little bit more time and work, come up with key messages. So I think that we can say that age-friendly communities are climate-friendly communities, but what if we take it one step further and actually have some data or science behind it that can say that age-friendly communities are actually low-carbon communities? So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for collaboration. And that's just an example within provincial government, but you could do that cross-government as well.
I've got a question. I think it follows right along with what you started out here in terms of Garrett used the pun of a crosswalk when we're talking about walkability, but that there's so much work in leadership here in Canada and around the world on fall prevention, so that on one hand, we're talking about walkability, and then there's this whole, and maybe it's the same people, I don't know, but is dealing with fall prevention. They really need to, because, how does that come together? Well, there's better lighting, there's rails in areas where there's different, it seems like that would be an obvious point of agreement.
Well, I guess the last two comments kind of touch on this, but it's sort of marrying some of these objectives in terms of improving community design. There's been really excellent presentations on sort of community planning, community design. And one of the things that we've found with a lot of the communities we've talked to is they're interested in community design with respect to air pollution, interested in community design with respect to healthy communities, and they're interested in community design with respect to reducing the urban heat island because of climate change. So we actually did a very quick scan with a student in terms of some of the recommendations that have been coming out in these 3 different areas. And from our very quick scan, what was interesting was they were all the same recommendations. They're very, very close. And I think it's very powerful for public health officials if you can talk about these sort of cumulative benefits from taking the same types of actions. And I think it's kind of reflected in what the last 2 speakers said. So it'd be great to have those types of studies that I think really get at, there's multiple benefits here and real efficiencies, I think, in taking action.
I think.
Sarah Henderson from the BC CDC. We're doing a lot of work with sort of heat health emergencies in the Lower Mainland, and one of the things that's become really evident to me is these cross collaborations across different community groups and governments. And I guess as a Canadian, and this is a pretty nationally specific question and concern, I am concerned about, the current federal situation, and that we now have a leader who is probably a climate change denier. I wouldn't be surprised. Is really not very interested in scientific evidence, I don't think, and I'm not sure how interested he is in seniors either. And I'm
give him a couple of years.
Pardon? Yeah, well, but I'm just like, are people afraid of that and what it's going to mean for what's happening in Canada, or is it just going to plow on ahead regardless?
Is that a rhetorical question?
No, it's not a question.
Okay, are we having specific? Oh, Rico, please, the panel, and then because because that's a huge question. That's a whole other question. But yeah.
Well, maybe at a stage.
I think.
Canada in particular.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm going to turn it back on because I turned it off. Yeah.
I guess that's a kind of a difficult question, and I would say that you're not alone. There's a lot of concern out there. Recently went to a talk, or actually a conference in Montreal, where a lot of Quebec regional health authorities were present, and they were planning for extreme heat events. And they're raising the same concerns. They're uncertain whether the budget that they've received is going to still be there, whether the federal support is still going to be there. We hope it will. We still don't have a certain answer there. As far as concerned, we're moving forward with what our plans are. We are one of the organizations in the federal government that looks at climate change. There's Public Health Agency of Canada, there's Environment Canada. We hope all of us are pretty much in the same boat, hoping.
And I'm just going to pass this to Larry, and then we have this gentleman here who's going to speak after Larry, and then Stephen's got the
This, I think, maybe ties in with your question, but was something I thought of after on your question about collaboration. Ministry of Health put forward a few years ago a matching funding to create a cross-ministerial that all the ADM, all the deputy ministers would come to, and said that they put up $5 million and offered to have funds matched by other ministries to create a common pot of money to accomplish some of these common objectives that we talked about could have. And I wonder if that's not a model that already exists. And in that cross-ministerial committee, one thing that could come out of that is that in the U.S., there's a lot of discussion about performance-based transportation funding, and it doesn't need to be transportation; it could be anything. But where you actually tie the money, some pot of money, to some metrics that sort of accomplishes. If you want to have additional funding for transit, here's the things you need to do with your land use. And so it says, that it just ties funding to performance. Because right now, the behavior we're getting is exactly the behavior we should get, given the incentives that we have or don't have for getting resources. So that's a simple concept, but it's not done.
Right.
Thank you. I live in Ottawa, so I very much share some of your concern. But I try to convince myself from time to time there's actually an encouraging answer to that. And our current Prime Minister, and I can say this now because I'm no longer a federal government official, our current Prime Minister is a conservative. He's not a liberal. And with small letters. And what that means he is more likely to respond to what Canadians want than to lead. I mean, that's really the definition, ultimately, of the difference between a conservative and a liberal. And I think that there are some signs that there's a growing weight of opinion and engagement in this country that could lead to convincing him to change his present attitude to climate change, which is one in which it's a comparative nuisance. The provinces, for example, British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, to mention just but 3, are already way ahead of a lot of federal thinking. And we have a history in Canada and also in the United States where the federal government follows either the provinces or the states. The other is that, and related to this, the theme of this conference, is that as somebody said today, seniors vote, grandchildren don't. So if you could get seniors engaged on this issue, I think they could have an enormous influence. I mean, typically our voting level is low, but it's supposed to be higher among seniors. So I think there's a challenge for us just to engage seniors. And I mean, I've got all sorts of conflicting signals today about whether that's possible or not. But they do represent a large part of our society and a significant voter strength. I mean, the other area that I've been frustrated in is with church groups. I've recently been given the opportunity to speak nationally to both the Anglican Church and the United Church of Canada, who wanted to hear about this. But I've not felt I've been successful in actually getting them politically engaged. That's what it means. That they're too comfortable where they are at the moment. But again, like older people, elderly people, these church groups, these faith-based groups, also represent an enormous voting bloc. So it's a long answer to you, but I think there are some positive signals that, in fact, we're going to tackle this issue regardless of the current Prime Minister. My fear is that we're getting perilously late. We're running out of time.
That's positive, though.
Yeah, I think that probably climate change will force him to act whether he wants to or not. And it just depends how severe the changes are. But my question to the panelists as a physiologist, and I think I better say something for the physiologists, because when we talk about built environments, we talk about strategies during heat waves and the elderly, and as a physiologist I think, what are the capabilities of the elderly? And we can have walkability of neighborhoods, but elderly individuals that aren't capable to walk. So I think the union between the physiologists and the planners and the policymakers needs to be to make assessments of elderly, first of all, their willingness, and secondly of all, their capabilities to perform, to walk, and to be involved in those types of strategies. So I really think the physiology side is an important one that shouldn't be ignored.
And I can't agree with you more. One of the documents that I didn't have an opportunity to mention just because I got the 2-minute warning sign that we're developing, we haven't released it yet, is a vulnerability assessment. So that factors in some of the physiological challenges that some of the vulnerable populations may be facing, as well as the community challenges like the walkability that we've talked about, as well as the urban heat island effect. And the underlying, I guess, basis of the whole assessment is the engagement of stakeholders, including researchers, physiologists, as well as the community workers. And hopefully with those powers at hand, you'll be able to come up with a solution or two to actually help those who don't have the ability to adapt to extreme heat event because of inability to acclimatize or because of the medication dependence, etc.
We can design everything, but if the individual isn't capable of participating or isn't willing to participate, that there's no reason for the design.
Well, and I completely agree. And one conference that I attended actually just a couple of weeks ago is on equity. And it was, I guess the strongest thing that came out from that conference is the absence of voice. So when you're not, I guess, in good standing financially or sociologically, you don't get your voice heard. And that was a major thing. And I hope that through our efforts as well as the efforts of other groups such as those who are fighting for equality as well as those fighting for other not necessarily climate change related issues but maybe just seniors and their health will kind of lead us to the same end goal at the end of the day.
If I could just add, I know we didn't go into great detail, but the smart growth movement, there's a lot of principles. Walkable communities is just one of them. And the mixed use issue is an issue also for caregivers getting to loved ones or getting to the people they need to care for during flooding or in extreme heat. And so affordable housing, I mean, it almost deals with the whole construct of all of the injustices that we have in our society that I won't say design is the only solution, but it definitely is one thing that can deal with many economies of scope through just poor design. I mean, poor design has created a lot of mess that we're trying to get out of right now. And I thought, actually, going back to, is it Stefan? Stephen, sorry. Stephen's, pictures of visualizing how things could be differently. We used to have people who lived right next to where they worked. And then we had created this whole system where, the people who are on the minimum wage jobs, at least in the States, live way the heck out. And they often don't have a car. So they are already, carless to start with. And that's also the poor people who were also affected when Katrina hit, in that whole area, just tons of people. And again, the opportunities when we can have green energy by having the higher density. So there is a public transportation, even for the suburbs, if it's just every 15 minutes, that could, again, reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help have people more connected socially, has so many things. So, yes, we have to worry about the physiology, but we also, I think, have to look about the environment in which we live. The home, as Paula Lawton would talk about, is the most important thing. Those who are most frail, we have to care about. The nursing homes in France, where a lot of these people died, that's an issue. The high rises is an issue during extreme heat, but if, again, if we can design a better world, whatever the term is, resiliency for people of all ages, I think that's kind of the goal.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was just hoping that, at least for the elderly subset, that their abilities need to be, their physiological abilities might be something we could consider in that, and their willingness to.
Okay, I've got Tim Takaro, and then I'm going to come back to Larry.
I think related to this, something that Peter brought up earlier, we have a lot of expertise in messaging on the panel and in the audience. And I'm curious about this notion of keeping messages simple versus utilizing the fact that our response to many of the problems we've discussed today are roughly the same. We have the air pollution message, we have the heat message, we have the pollen message, we have the UV message, we have the get out and exercise, we have the don't get out and exercise. Is there a way, and Stephen, I've been so impressed with what you're able to do with visualizations, is there a way to consolidate messages such that, particularly this demographic that we're talking about, can get it all at once and not piecemeal and confused, because in fact sometimes the messages are in conflict.
Steve, can I give you 1 second to compose your answer? Because Larry has a direct response to the physiologist, so I don't want to... It gives you... compose your...
I'm from New York, we're very polite.
places.
Actually, there's a lot of evidence now accumulating. There's actually some, you might look at some studies being done in, I think it's called Little Havana in Miami. Scott, I'm trying to remember their names, but the ability to maintain to be able-bodied is correlated with your level of physical activity, which is associated with your environment. So actually, there's reasonable amount of evidence. We don't have the longitudinal stuff in place yet, but in fact, being self-reliant may likely last longer the more active you are, which is now, I think that evidence is reasonable, and we know from a causal pathway that the more you're likely to remain more active in a more walkable environment. So the question is, if you think about this, is that once, yes, you are no longer, you become dependent on others, then Kathy's response kicks in exactly, which is you're going to want to be in places where others you can access emergency things faster. The cost of healthcare service delivery for people scattered across the landscape is going to undermine our entire economy. It's huge, and we haven't even measured those costs. So those are some things to think about, and I think these folks measured grip strength actually as a function of urban form in a specific cohort of elderly folks from Cuba living in Miami. And so they had a pretty isolated population and really nailed the built environment measurement. And it's just interesting to think about this, so it's just a different way to think about it, so I wanted to say.
Yeah, the idea of having a walkable environment to encourage people to stay active as they age, I couldn't agree more. So, I don't know, when we talk about the number of automobiles, and I think some of the correlative data that you were, well, maybe you're saying that if you had a car, you could get, at least in Atlanta, was that the example?
Where there's no place to exercise in your neighborhood, if you have a car, you're more likely to be active.
Yeah.
That's the problem, is the neighborhood design doesn't allow you to be walkable. So
yeah.
You need a car to be active.
Yeah, so building the environment to make it walkable. Well, I seem to remember when I was in Atlanta, they told me if I got on a bus for about 45 minutes, there'd be a safe place I could exercise in a park, otherwise just go to the gym in the basement. So maybe some other social issues there.
So I'll try and answer Tim's point, which I think also relates to the federal question in a curious way. So there's two aspects to the answer, or the approaches, I think. Is it possible to consolidate complex and sometimes conflicting information into one sort of coherent message? At the level of message, at the level of sort of short-term impact, kind of things we've seen today, then I think, it is possible to consolidate a lot, not necessarily resolve all the contradictions, but at least to pull a lot of things together, joined up thinking, connecting the dots, whatever you want to call it. I think it is possible, but it works, I think, most easily with integrative tools, integrative media. So pictures, certainly. Maps, certainly. I mean, some of Larry's maps, I think, are incredibly powerful because they make you look at your neighborhood. So I think this issue of putting it into a local, place-based, limited context is an excellent frame for taking loads of other things that would otherwise be all over the map. So in terms of a message, I think the more realistic, Photoshop-y type pictures, are not all Photoshop, by the way, but some are, some aren't. It certainly help. We've got good, clear evidence of that it raises lots of issues, lots of questions of people. If Stuart was here, he'd say it's a dialogue starter. So we know that works at some level, and I'm sure you've had similar reactions on some of these mapping things because they're places but you've never looked at it that way, and suddenly you have a metric that is, well, yeah, okay, that doesn't make sense, does it? So I think that's very powerful, and those can integrate. But they are only a message, and they're a snapshot in time. And I think the second level, which is much deeper, is then what process follows that? What sort of cultural context is there for that information, not just to be presented once, but to resonate, for people to be involved in producing their own? Then I think you can go deeper. You can then sort of begin to explore, we have these conflicts between adaptation and mitigation, or between the infirm and those that can walk. And if there's a mechanism, I tend to think of local planning because that's sort of what it's there for, that nobody shows up. Same people always show up. But if you could enlarge that circle, and there are ways, Google Earth, there are all kinds of online communities, still keep the spatial frame, but go over time, use some of these same tools, but have it embedded in a process. That's sort of what that manual that we talked about, the guidance manual, is about. It's more about process than just the snapshots. Then I think you have a chance, because you can get a working group. Many communities are doing what are called climate action local working groups. It's not limited to climate action, but it represents multiple stakeholders. And then, even if it's confusing, well, someone can do the transportation report, and then somebody else will meet at somebody's house 3 weeks later, and they'll do the energy audits. And it becomes a forum that you can actually begin to integrate these difficult, more complicated things. So that'd be my suggestion: is use the graphics or the snappy things to get people sort of hooked, but then try and build it out into a long-term process. That's what our results seem to be suggesting.
Thanks, Stephen. Anastasia's got a response too. How are we doing for time?
Thank you.
5 minutes?
I just wanted to follow up. One of the research projects, we have a summer student on board right now, and one of her research projects is exactly that. She's looking at the messaging that is currently being distributed in some of the Canadian municipalities that specifically touch on climate change related issues, whether it's heat, West Nile virus, or infectious diseases, etc., and looking to see where the messages align and where they contradict. And based on the information that she finds, based on what is currently being disseminated to the public, we'd be able to actually take further action, whether to align them where it fits or where the solution can be found, or still keep it with the underlying information that there is, with the understanding that there is conflicting messages in some places. And again, workshops is a great solution to move forward once that information is collected and somewhat analyzed.
But there is this issue about the workshop thing that, I mean, the people who come are the people you don't really need to come. They're the ones who always come, and you know what I mean? It's the, somebody who might open the newspaper and look at their quality index, if they really could understand it, and if it gave them the information that they needed to decide whether they were going to walk to the corner store that day or not. That's that's sort of the base that I really think we, as public health at least, really need to reach. And they're not going to probably come to a workshop.
And I think, as with all these issues, there's a plurality of answers to that. There isn't going to be one key, easy message for everybody to get. It's, who do seniors listen to, what networks they engage in, And then, actually, I just quickly, before Lisa has a point, I do want to acknowledge the fact that we're on Coast Salish territory, traditional territory, and it would be nice to see First Nations elders here. They have a lot of traditional knowledge, and they have a lot of advice and a lot of knowledge that can be brought to solutions, as well as expressing the challenges in sometimes a more immediate way than a lot of people, because they're seeing the changes. They're more close to the land generally. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the comment that, my suspicion is that trying to combine multiple messages probably wouldn't be horribly effective, that it's like too much like mass communication and almost overwhelming. That when you look at change models or change theories, like Prochaska's theoretical, change model, and then you look at social marketing, I think that the more you understand your target audience and the more you understand what the message is that you want them to change or the behavior that you want them to change, the more likely you are, in theory, to bring about a positive outcome. That if you have too many messages that are happening simultaneously, that it can run into difficulties.
Although it looks like that. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just on the communication issue. Early in my sort of career incarnations, at one stage I was involved in communications. We had a scriptwriter who used to work for the BBC, and he said, understand the two mediums. Understand the print media if you want to convey information. Understand the video medium. At that stage it was quite expensive to do video, but you need that to
sort of convey the emotion and bring people on board on the emotion. And ideally, you want to bring those two together. Of course, now we have this whole area of the social media. It's been mentioned a few times today, and people can put together a video clip up into YouTube very quickly. And so it seems to me that there's also the question of maximizing the use of social media to sort of get messages across that we would never have dreamt of in the past. I mean, even in a very practical level. I mean, I have grandchildren who are at the other side of the world. I actually see more of them on Skype at zero cost than I see of some whoever is a little more physically closer. And so there are a huge there are communication opportunities out there that I really think need to be taken advantage of. And finally, for the poor folk, and I mean it's sort of poor is the wrong word to use, but for people who are working in government, I talked about the election cycle. There's another thing called the budget cycle. And suddenly there's a clampdown, and you can't even travel across the water, and you have to get a minister's permission to travel. And that is really tough. That is really tough. And it sort of undercuts the credibility of people who are encouraging programs, and then suddenly this kneecapping occurs. And so, but maybe the making moves in social.
Yeah, touching upon the social media comment, I think the BC government has really opened the doors for ministries to use social media in a way that government hasn't before. And we've seen a lot of success of very simple projects that cost very little money, reaching a huge amount of people that we would have never been able to reach out before. So as an example, we did an initiative called the King Tide Initiative. It was modeled on an Australian experience. And in the wintertime during the storm cycle at the high tide events, and we published the tides and got people to know when the high tide in their community was happening, and got people walking around their neighborhoods with a camera, taking photos of what their communities look like at high tide, and uploading those photos on a common Flickr page so all we have to do is provide the space, and people provide the content now. We're not providing the content, other people are. Or I could also go away from this think tank right now, put on my Twitter feed a little quip about what's been going on here with an adaptation hashtag. Who knows how many people are following an adaptation hashtag? Is it thousands? Is it, there's lots of opportunities that really don't cost a lot of money that we can really take advantage of.
But how many of those people are seniors?
Well, that's kind of one of the points that I was making in the talk is probably probably not a lot. So what are the other ways? What are the other mechanisms that we can use to engage, or where are the opportunities to, if there's willingness to bring seniors into sort of new forms of communication? I don't know. I'm not the expert on that. So.
I was just thinking about the comment that was made about the people that come to an event. They're already preaching to the converted, so to speak, but they become our legs on the street. If we empower them with the knowledge, then they go out and actually reach the people that we're trying to reach, that the social media might not reach. So not to give up on that group.
And social media also provides some opportunities for cross-generational dialogues as well. So.
2 points. Just responding to yours, I know some of those people, and some of them what we call evangelical environmentalists, and I would never send them on the doorstep. So he's picking the right people of the group that you have. And we have this guy called Compost John, who has the lowest carbon footprint in the UK, he's very good. But when you look at his life, he doesn't have to have a job. He's paid off his mortgage, so he's living a very different lifestyle. So I've had that problem. Do I use these people in my community project or not? But going back to what you said, and also it's a question for Stephen about, and also it's what another speaker mentioned, about the engaging older people, but also using their knowledge and using their knowledge of environmental change. And although you've had techniques on visioning, whether you've been able to look at techniques to capture knowledge, and I know they do that in, say, developing countries in terms of indigenous knowledge of environmental change. And I think that this could be one area where I would like to explore further, where you can actually go in to get people then to talk about how's your environment changed since you lived here, and then, well, what do you think it will change in the future, and then bring the climate message, which might be more appealing.
Well, it's a really good point, and I think we don't spend enough time mining the history and the oral histories and those kinds of things. We certainly used historical imagery of, for example, aerial photos change over time in the past. And you do get those stories, and so when you do qualitative interviews, obviously you pick those stories up. Do we catch them early enough to actually weave them in? I think that would be a much better, richer way of doing it. And part of it, I think, is sort of finding vehicles, whether they're online vehicles like the King Climate Project, or oral histories, museum-based. I can think of various examples. I think that stuff does resonate, and the key is connecting it, I think, then to the scientific, the practical, the decision-making, all the stuff about the informed planning. That's where the gap. Often these things sit in archives and they're really neat, but it's not connected to planning or to land use.
Or communicated as terms.
Yeah.
So I think we should wrap it up. I'm intending to finish about 5:15. So I don't know about you, but my head is absolutely spinning and full to the brim with... I think we're just at the beginning of solving all the problems, but this is a really, really good start. Gloria, do you have a few comments you want to make before we... Fighting a bug, so...
Well, all of you were handpicked. You are the chosen. And you were chosen very specifically because you each bring a different perspective. And I'm a gerontologist. Gerontologists are people who understand that if you're going to talk about aging, you're going to have to know a little bit about housing, about health, about finance, about policy, about communication, many, many, many different aspects, a little bit of all of those, because real people are influenced by a number of different things. I also work on an international level, and I'm constantly aware that we have a number of intersecting trends. So we have urbanization, we've got climate change, we have the issue of aging, we have migration. There are many things going on simultaneously. And so we really do need collectively to put some of the pieces together. And I was very enthused by some of the things we heard today, where there were ideas that were brought to the table that I hadn't thought about, or angles, or tools, various kinds of tools. Stephen's lab, when we did a site visit, Heather and I went out there, I was very impressed because many times people will say, well, we'll bring a focus group, get a bunch of seniors together and ask them what they need. Well, if they knew what they needed, then they would have asked for it a long time ago. When my husband brought home a microwave oven, I looked at him and said, what do I need it for? Right? And then you start using it and you realize what a difference it makes in your life. Similarly, cell phones, the various kinds of communication media that we've seen. Like I said before, we are living in a unique and a new historical time. We have an opportunity to do things together, things that would not have flown 5 years ago, or maybe even 2 years ago, may damn well fly now. And so the task that we charge you with and that we brought you together for is in a sense, this was a master class. This was like the group we brought together last year of young people who didn't know each other and who were very much coming from different disciplines. and had some presentations. And what we did was keep that group together. So that's why you're invited to come to dinner with us tonight. We'll keep you together as much as we can. And tomorrow, we want you to think some more, to mix with the group. And I want you to know very clearly that even though some of the same people are talking, they're not talking necessarily about the same things. So we're going to build on this. I also was having a really hard time not jumping up and saying, but if you come to some of the symposia tomorrow, there's going to be papers, there's research that's going to be presented that is dealing dead on with some of the questions that were raised today. I can tell you that one of the symposium number 1, I'm a co-author on 2 of the papers that are going to be presented, and they are, one of them had to do with seniors groups, working with seniors to empower seniors to train other seniors. There's another one dealing with e-learning. There's one dealing with narratives, using narrative, another one dealing with intergenerational communications, just in that one symposium. And each symposium was put together because it brings something different and something new and that expands on the topics today. So I was also very intrigued by the comment from our physiologist colleague, and it made me think that maybe one of the things we should give you as a little bit of homework is that the different disciplines, maybe think about, from what you heard today, what is the message, or what would you like us to take forward? And then tomorrow we might think about having a few small groups that are interdisciplinary, because I would like to see us come up with some very specific messages. We've got the brand new secretary, Parliamentary Secretary for Seniors to the Minister of Health from BC is coming tomorrow morning to open the session. The Minister of State for Seniors is somebody that a number of us, the previous ones, we've worked with very closely, and they have been very effective in helping us to move the agenda forward. We've got a brand new one. The last guy was invited to come, but because of the election and the fact that he did a good job, he got promoted up to another position, a higher position. But we've got a brand new Minister of State for Seniors who lives in Richmond, British Columbia, and who happens to be a PhD. So as soon as this conference is over, there are a few of us that are already plotting and scheming on, we're going to go collectively to meet her and to carry various of our agenda items through and make them, we want her to become our next best friend. So there are opportunities, and we are thinking about the political situation. Now let us try to get the right messages. A few zingers. You talked about Zimmers. We have a magazine called Zoomers, and if we can come up with a few zingers, maybe 10 statements of things that are going to capture the attention of various of the constituencies, then we will really have done our job. So on that note, I think we've had a good day. Thank you, everybody.